On a ferry crossing the dark waters between Palermo and Naples on March 25, 1938, one of the most brilliant minds in physics simply vanished into thin air. Not literally, of course, but the effect was the same. Ettore Majorana, a man whose intellect was so extraordinary that even Nobel Prize winners called him a genius, stepped onto that ship and was never seen again. What happened that night remains one of science's most haunting mysteries. To understand why this disappearance shocked the scientific world, we need to go back to where it all began, in the sun-drenched island of Sicily in 1906. Ettore Majorana was born on August 5th in Catania, the second largest city on the island, into a family that valued education above almost everything else. His father, Fabio Majorana, wasn't just any ordinary man. He was an engineer, a businessman, and a man of considerable influence in Sicilian society.
The Majorana name carried weight in those circles, and young Ettore was expected to live up to that legacy. From his earliest years, it was clear that Ettore was different, not just smart, but different in a way that made people stop and take notice. His mind worked like a precision instrument, processing complex mathematical concepts with the ease that other children showed when playing with toys. His father, recognizing this exceptional gift, took personal charge of his son's early education. But even Fabio, accomplished as he was, soon realized that Ettore's capabilities far exceeded what he could nurture at home. When Ettore was still a young boy, his parents made the difficult decision to send him to a boarding school in Rome. It was a choice that would separate the family, but they knew it was necessary for their son's intellectual development. The transition from the warm, familiar streets of Catania to the bustling capital of Italy must have been overwhelming for a sensitive child. But Ettore adapted with the same quiet determination that would characterize his entire life. In 1921, when Ettore was 15, the entire family made the move to Rome permanently. By this time, it was clear that their son was no ordinary student. He finished his high school education in 1923 at the remarkable age of 17, demonstrating not just intelligence, but a maturity and focus that impressed his teachers. Yet despite his academic achievements, those who knew him noticed something else about Ettore. He was intensely private, almost withdrawn, preferring the company of books to that of his peers. After completing his secondary education, Ettore initially enrolled to study engineering at the University of Rome. It seemed like a natural choice, following in his father's footsteps. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. In those days, the physics department at the University of Rome was beginning to buzz with excitement. A young professor named Enrico Fermi had arrived, and he was gathering around him a group of brilliant students who would later be known as the Via Panispina Boys, named after the street where their laboratory was located. The story of how Ettore first encountered Fermi has become legendary in scientific circles. As an undergraduate, Ettore had heard whispers about this charismatic professor who was revolutionizing the understanding of atomic physics. Curious, he decided to pay Fermi a visit. When he arrived at the laboratory, Fermi was working on some complex calculations, scribbling equations and notes across a blackboard. Ettore looked at the work for a few minutes, said nothing, and left. The next day he returned. This time he carried with him a sheet of paper covered in his own handwriting. Without a word, he handed it to Fermi. What Fermi saw astonished him. Ettore had not only understood the complex problem that had taken Fermi days to work through, but he had also solved it, providing solutions that were both elegant and correct. And he had done it all from memory, without taking a single note during his brief visit the day before. That moment changed everything. Fermi immediately recognized that he was dealing with someone extraordinary, and he convinced Ettore to switch from engineering to physics. It was a decision that would shape the course of modern science, though no one could have predicted the tragic way it would all end. Joining Fermi's group was like entering a different world for Ettore. The Via Panispina laboratory wasn't just a place of scientific research. It was a community of young, brilliant minds all pushing the boundaries of what was known about the universe. There was Emilio Sega, who would later discover the antiproton and win a Nobel Prize. There was Bruno Pontecorvo, whose work would later play a crucial role in understanding neutrinos. There was Franco Rasetti, Fermi's closest collaborator and a man whose experimental skills were legendary. Among this constellation of talent, Ettore stood out not for his personality, but for his mind. While the others were gregarious and social, Ettore remained somewhat apart. He was friendly enough, but there was always a distance, as if he were observing the world from behind an invisible barrier. His colleagues respected him enormously, but they also found him enigmatic. The work that emerged from the Via Panaspina laboratory in those years would reshape physics forever. They were exploring the mysteries of the atomic nucleus, conducting experiments with neutrons, and developing theories that would eventually lead to both nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Fermi was the acknowledged leader of the group, but Ettore's theoretical contributions were often the most profound and far-reaching. His first significant work dealt with atomic spectroscopy, the study of how atoms absorb and emit light. But Ettore's approach was different from others. Where most physicists focused on experimental observations and tried to explain them, Ettore seemed to intuit the underlying mathematical structures that governed these phenomena. His papers were often dense and difficult to follow, not because they were poorly written, but because they operated at a level of abstraction that few others could match. As the 1930s progressed, Ettore's reputation within the scientific community grew. Word of his extraordinary abilities spread beyond Rome. In 1933, he received an invitation that would prove crucial to his development as a scientist. Werner Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum mechanics and a Nobel Prize winner, invited Ettore to spend time at his institute in Leipzig, Germany. The months Ettore spent in Leipzig were transformative. Working with Heisenberg allowed him to refine his understanding of quantum mechanics and to begin developing ideas that were years ahead of their time. It was during this period that he began to formulate what would later be recognized as some of his most important theoretical contributions. One of these contributions would eventually bear his name, the Majorana equation. This was a modification of the famous Dirac equation that described particles called fermions. What made Ettore's version special was that it described particles that were their own antiparticles. At the time, this seemed like an abstract mathematical curiosity. Today, these Majorana fermions are at the cutting edge of quantum computing research, potentially holding the key to building quantum computers that are stable and practical. But perhaps even more significant was his theoretical prediction of the existence of neutrons. This work, completed before the neutron was actually discovered experimentally, demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to see patterns in nature that others missed. When the neutron was finally detected in 1932 by James Chadwick, many physicists realized that Ettore had essentially predicted its existence through pure theoretical reasoning. Despite these remarkable achievements, those close to Ettore began to notice troubling changes in his personality. The withdrawn nature that had always characterized him seemed to be deepening into something more concerning. He became increasingly introspective, spending long hours alone, and seemed to be struggling with questions that went beyond physics. Part of this struggle may have been spiritual. Ettore had always been a devout Catholic, and the implications of the atomic research being conducted at Via Panaspina weighed heavily on him. He could see, more clearly perhaps than his colleagues, where this research was leading. The power locked inside the atomic nucleus was immense, and Ettore understood that it could be used for purposes far removed from the pure pursuit of knowledge. In 1937, something unexpected happened that would change the trajectory of Ettore's life. Despite his reluctance to pursue an academic career and his preference for working in the background, he was offered a professorship in theoretical physics at the University of Naples. This was an extraordinary honor for someone so young, and it represented recognition of his exceptional contributions to science. The appointment came about in an unusual way. Rather than going through the normal competitive process, Ettore was essentially appointed directly by the Italian Minister of Education, who had been convinced by testimonials from leading physicists about Ettore's unique abilities. Fermi himself had written, "There are several categories of scientists, those of second or third rank who do their best but don't get far. Then there are those of first rank who make important discoveries. And finally, there are geniuses like Galileo and Newton. Majorana is one of them." Moving to Naples should have been the beginning of a brilliant academic career. The position offered Ettore the opportunity to pursue his research while training the next generation of physicists. But instead of embracing this opportunity, he seemed to become even more troubled and withdrawn. His time in Naples was brief and marked by increasing isolation. Colleagues who tried to engage him in conversation found him polite but distant. Students who attended his lectures, which were rare, described them as brilliant but delivered by someone who seemed to be speaking from a great distance, as if his mind were elsewhere. Those who knew him well began to worry. His family noticed that his letters home had become increasingly melancholic. His colleagues observed that he seemed to be wrestling with some internal conflict that he wouldn't or couldn't share with others. The man who had once been quietly confident in his scientific abilities now seemed haunted by doubts about the direction of his work and its implications. The political climate in Italy during these years certainly didn't help. Mussolini's fascist government was growing increasingly aggressive, and there were disturbing signs that the scientific research being conducted in laboratories across Europe might soon be turned toward military purposes. For a sensitive and deeply religious man like Ettore, the prospect that his theoretical work might contribute to weapons of mass destruction was profoundly troubling. As 1938 began, Ettore's mental state seemed to be deteriorating further. He had always been prone to periods of deep introspection, but now these seemed to be lasting longer and affecting his ability to function normally. He began to speak, in vague terms, about the burden of knowledge and the responsibility that came with understanding the fundamental forces of nature. In March of 1938, Ettore made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He announced that he was going to take a trip to Sicily to visit family. This was unusual for someone who rarely traveled and preferred the solitude of his study to the social obligations of family visits. But his colleagues and family members were actually pleased by this decision, hoping that time in his native Sicily might help lift his spirits. On March 23rd, Ettore arrived in Palermo. He spent 2 days there, visiting relatives and wandering the streets of the city where his family had deep roots. To those who saw him during this time, he seemed somewhat more at peace than he had been in Naples. There was a calmness about him that hadn't been present for months. On March 25th, Ettore went to the port in Palermo and purchased a ticket for the overnight ferry to Naples. It was a routine journey that thousands of passengers made regularly. The weather was calm, the sea was relatively quiet, and there was nothing unusual about the circumstances of the voyage. But before boarding the ferry, Ettore did something that, in retrospect, would seem ominous. He wrote 2 letters. The first was to the director of the Physics Institute at the University of Naples, Antonio Carelli. In it, he wrote, "Dear Carelli, I made a decision that has become unavoidable. There isn't a bit of selfishness in it, but I realize what trouble my sudden disappearance will be for you and the students. For this, I beg your forgiveness, but especially for betraying the trust, the sincere friendship, and the sympathy you gave me over these past months. I am at your disposal for further details. Regards, E. Majorana." The second letter was to his family. It was shorter but equally cryptic. "I have made a decision that was becoming necessary. Don't take it too tragically and don't wear mourning for me. If you want to remember me, do it with joy, because that would make me happy. University regards to everyone." These letters were not immediately delivered. Ettore gave them to someone with instructions that they should only be sent if he didn't return from his trip. The fact that he wrote such letters suggests that he was already contemplating some kind of dramatic action though exactly what he intended remains unclear. The ferry left Palermo on the evening of March 25th and was scheduled to arrive in Naples the following morning. It was a journey that Ettore had made before, and there was nothing unusual about the vessel or the conditions. The passenger manifest showed that Ettore Majorana was aboard, and several witnesses later confirmed seeing him on the ship. But when the ferry docked in Naples on the morning of March 26th, Ettore was nowhere to be found. His cabin was empty, his belongings were gone, and there was no sign of what had happened to him. It was as if one of the most brilliant minds in physics had simply vanished into thin air. When news of Ettore's disappearance reached Rome, the scientific community was stunned. Fermi immediately contacted the authorities and offered a substantial reward for information about his former student. The Italian Navy launched a search of the waters between Sicily and Naples. Investigators interviewed passengers and crew members from the ferry, but no trace of Ettore was ever found. The letters that Ettore had written before boarding the ferry only added to the mystery. Their content suggested that he had planned his disappearance, but they gave no clear indication of his intentions. Did he plan to take his own life? Had he decided to disappear and start a new life somewhere else? Or had something else entirely happened to him? In the days and weeks following the disappearance, various theories emerged. Some believed that Ettore had committed suicide, overwhelmed by the burden of his knowledge and the implications of atomic research. The fact that he had written what appeared to be farewell letters seemed to support this theory. Others suggested that he had been kidnapped or killed, perhaps by agents working for foreign governments who wanted to prevent his knowledge from falling into enemy hands. The late 1930s were a time of increasing international tension, and the strategic importance of atomic research was becoming apparent to intelligence agencies around the world. A third theory, and perhaps the most intriguing, was that Ettore had deliberately chosen to disappear and had succeeded in starting a new life somewhere else. Proponents of this theory pointed to his methodical nature and suggested that someone with his intellectual abilities would have been capable of planning and executing a perfect disappearance. Over the years, there have been numerous alleged sightings of Ettore in various parts of the world. Some claim to have seen him in Argentina, where many Europeans emigrated in the years following World War II. Others reported encounters in monasteries in Italy, suggesting that he had chosen a life of religious seclusion. A few even claimed to have seen him in the Soviet Union, implying that he had defected to work on atomic research for the communist government. But none of these sightings were ever confirmed, and investigators who followed up on the most promising leads invariably found them to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. The truth was that Ettore Majorana had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The impact of his disappearance on the scientific community was profound. Fermi, who had discovered and nurtured Ettore's talent, was devastated. He continued to hope for years that his former student would return, and he kept Ettore's theoretical work alive by discussing it with other physicists and ensuring that his contributions were not forgotten. The timing of Ettore's disappearance was particularly tragic from a scientific perspective. The late 1930s and early 1940s saw explosive developments in atomic physics, culminating in the development of nuclear weapons. Ettore's theoretical insights might have played a crucial role in these developments, potentially influencing both the timeline of the Manhattan Project and the ultimate design of nuclear weapons. But beyond the immediate scientific implications, Ettore's disappearance raised profound questions about the relationship between scientific knowledge and moral responsibility. Had he vanished because he couldn't bear the thought that his work might contribute to weapons of unprecedented destructive power? Was his disappearance a form of protest against the militarization of scientific research? These questions became even more poignant when, just a few years after Ettore's disappearance, the world witnessed the devastating power of atomic weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Many of the physicists who had worked on the Manhattan Project later expressed regret about their involvement, and some became vocal advocates for nuclear disarmament. It's impossible not to wonder what Ettor's response would have been to these developments, and whether his early disappearance had been motivated by a prescient understanding of where atomic research was heading. As the decades passed, interest in the Majorana case never completely disappeared. New generations of physicists learned about his theoretical contributions and wondered about the mystery of his vanishing. Investigative journalists and amateur detectives continued to pursue leads and develop new theories about what had happened to him. In recent years, advances in our understanding of quantum physics have only increased appreciation for Ettor's theoretical insights. The Majorana fermions that he predicted are now at the center of cutting-edge research in quantum computing. Scientists around the world are working to harness these exotic particles to build quantum computers that could revolutionize everything from cryptography to drug discovery. It's one of the great ironies of science that a man who disappeared because he was troubled by the implications of his work has posthumously become central to technologies that could transform human civilization. But perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Majorana mystery is what it reveals about the human cost of scientific genius. Ettore was blessed with an extraordinary mind that allowed him to see patterns and connections that others missed. But this same gift became a burden when he realized the implications of what he had discovered. His story serves as a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, while noble, can exact a heavy psychological toll on those who push the boundaries of human understanding. The official investigations into Ettor's disappearance were never formally closed, and technically, the case remains open to this day. Every few years, new evidence surfaces or new theories are proposed, but none have definitively solved the mystery. In 2015, prosecutors in Rome reopened the investigation based on new testimony from witnesses who claimed to have information about Ettor's fate. But even these efforts failed to provide conclusive answers. What makes the Majorana case so enduringly fascinating is not just the mystery of what happened to him, but what his disappearance represents. In an age when scientific knowledge is advancing at an unprecedented pace, and when the ethical implications of new technologies are becoming increasingly complex, Ettor's story serves as a cautionary tale about the responsibilities that come with genius. The man who vanished from a ferry between Sicily and Naples on that March night in 1938 left behind more than just a scientific mystery. He left behind questions about the nature of knowledge, the burden of insight, and the price of understanding truths that others cannot yet see. His theoretical work continues to influence the frontiers of physics, while his disappearance continues to haunt those who study the history of science. And yet, there remains one final twist to this story that makes it even more heartbreaking than the simple tragedy of a brilliant mind lost too soon. Recent archival research has uncovered evidence that suggests Ettore may have been suffering from what we would now recognize as severe depression in the months leading up to his disappearance. Letters to family members, previously overlooked by investigators, describe periods of profound despair and references to feeling overwhelmed by the weight of his responsibilities. More significantly, medical records from the University of Naples, discovered only recently, indicate that Ettore had been consulting with a physician about symptoms that today would likely be diagnosed as anxiety and depression. The treatments available in the 1930s for mental health conditions were primitive and often ineffective, leaving someone like Ettore to struggle alone with conditions that might today be successfully managed. This revelation transforms our understanding of the Majorana mystery from a tale of scientific intrigue to a more human story of a brilliant mind struggling with mental illness, in an era when such struggles were neither understood nor effectively treated. It suggests that Ettore's disappearance may not have been motivated primarily by concerns about the implications of atomic research, but rather by a personal battle with depression that he ultimately lost. The tragedy is that had Ettore lived in our current era, he might have received the help he needed to manage his mental health and continue his groundbreaking scientific work. Instead, one of the most brilliant physicists in history became a casualty not just of his times, but of the very isolation that his genius imposed upon him. His story reminds us that behind every scientific breakthrough, there is a human being with all the vulnerabilities and struggles that come with being human, regardless of how extraordinary their gifts might be.